Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, I will take you through the steps, first building a Django RESTful API using the REST framework and configuring cores. Then we will work through building a Vue application using Axios to display data from our newly created Django REST API. So this tutorial represents part one of two tutorials working towards authentication via JWT using Django, Axios, and Vue. And also I'll go through the Vue JS storage. So the aim here in this tutorial is to configure and learn the underpinning configuration needed so that in the second tutorial we can just focus on the configuration of the authentication. As per normal, you can use the timeline provided in the video description area to navigate through this tutorial and focus in on the components you are interested in. So the first section, we're going to go through building a simple REST framework using Django. So I've made a new folder here on my C drive, and now I'm going to start a new project. Like I previously said, if you're familiar with this setup, then just head over to the next section and move through the video utilizing the timeline provided. If you're completely new to Django, you might want to head over to my other tutorials first and just set up your environment. You will need Python installed in order to get this working. So first of all, we're going to, like I said, set up this new project. I'm working here on the C drive in this folder. So I'm going to open up the command prompt and just head into this folder. So the first thing I'm going to set up is the virtual environment. So as per normal, I'm going to need Python, and I'm just going to make a new virtual environment folder. So now I can go ahead and activate the environment. So looking for a folder called scripts and then activate. Okay, so now we're activated. We can now pip install Django. That might take a couple of seconds. So now we have Django installed. We can now start a new Django project. So we'll use the Django admin to start project. And we're going to call this project D for Django REST API, and we're going to install it in this folder, not in a new folder, so I'd use the dot. Okay, so now we have this new project. You can see that it's included the manage.py, so we're going to be utilizing that now to create a new application. So we're going to build an application inside of this new project. We're just going to call that something simple, so let's go ahead and do that. So to build a new project, just going to type in py and then manage.py, and I'm just going to call this app. So we're going to start app. I'm just going to call this app. Okay, so now we have a new app folder. So we're going to be utilizing this app to build our RESTful API. So that's all that's needed at this point. Let's head over to our code editor and open this project. On the C drive, so let's select this project. Okay, so now we've opened the project. So remember that this is the main folder here, the REST API folder, and this is the app we just made. So we need to go into the settings of our main app, and the first thing we need to do is just register this new application in the installed apps. So I'm just going to call this app. So that just registers and tells our application that we have a new app called app. So as we're going to be building a RESTful API, we're going to need to install that into Django. So you can do that obviously via the terminal here. I'm using the command prompt here so you can just see it a little bit more clearly. So we're going to need to install an application. So pip install, and then we're installing the Django REST framework. So this is going to give us all the scaffolding, all the components that we need to build a RESTful API with Django. So once that's done, we can then head over to the app folder and models and create a simple model. Here I'll use database terminology. We've created a table here called posts, and inside of it we have two fields, title and contents. So by all means you can extend this. Maybe you already have an existing model that you want to utilize. It should still work if you follow this process. So that's that done. So with that in place, I'll just head back into the terminal, because I'll just go ahead now and migrate that. And then use the migrate command to commit that. So now we have our database in place. So we're going to need some data in our database, so we may as well use the admin to insert that. So we could just insert that manually, but let's just create a super user and go into the admin area and create some data. So here we're going to run a command, create super user, and then go ahead and fill in some of this information. There we go. Okay, so now we have a super user. We can now log into the admin area. So I'm just going to run the server. And, oh, I've forgotten the R. And then we can then go into the browser and go into the admin area. And use the username and password we've just created. And from here you can see that our model doesn't exist, because now we need to go into the admin area and just register our model so it's viewable in this area here. So back into our app here, we're going to go head over to the admin page, and from here we just need to add a little bit of code so that we can register our model so it appears in the admin area. So let's get rid of that. So all we need to do is import our model. So we just need to say from .models import, and then the model we just created, which was posts, and then we can get rid of that, and then admin.site.register, and then the name, which is post, or post, sorry. Was it posts or posts? Can't remember. Model posts. Okay, so now we've got that in place, we can now head back into, it should automatically update if we refresh. We've now got our new model called posts. So from here, I'm just going to go in and create some new posts. So new post 1, new post 1 content, and then I'll create 2 posts. There we go. So now we've got some content, and we can view that now when we actually build our Vue application. So we've got something to view. So for the next task, I built a new file here in my app folder called serializers.py. So the idea here is that we're going to build a serializer that's going to take the data from the database and prepare the data so it can then be used and transmitted through our API and utilized in this case by our Vue application. So here then I'm going to include from the REST framework, which we installed earlier, serializers. So now we have that resource available, and then we're going to need our model. So we're going to import our model posts. Okay, so now we build a new class, and I'm going to call that post serializer, and then we're going to need the serializer dot and model serializer. Okay, so now we just need to define the meta, which is basically just defining what data we want to serialize. So the model is going to be our model, which is posts that we created earlier, and then we just define the fields that we want to serialize. So here I'm going to just serialize them all because there's only 2 in there. So we use the So that's just going to take all the data from the database and serialize it. So it can then be utilized and sent across through our API and captured by our Vue app, and then it can then be displayed via Vue. So now we head over to our Vue in our app and just run through the stages here. So first of all, we're going to need a response from this API. So we import response, and we're going to be using generics because I'll talk about that in a second. And then we also need to import our models from Post. We need that data. And then of course the serializers that we just created. So we then create a new class called post views, and from generics we're utilizing retrieve API view, which if you read through the link here, and it's worth reading through the documentation, this is used to create a read-only endpoint to represent a single model instance. So this is going to be a read-only API. So now we import the query set. So here we're just running a query equivalent of select all from posts and putting it into this new variable called query set. And then we make a new function. So this function, we take in the query set. So we're going to need that. And then we run it through our serializer. And then we return that data. And that's what's then sent to the client or whoever's trying to consume this API. The last step is now just to configure the URLs. So let's head over to our main app, the REST API, and head over to the URLs. So first of all, we just need to build a link between this URLs and the new set of URLs we're going to create in the app folder. So we're going to need include here, and then we're going to create a new path. And this is basically just a link to the new URLs that we're going to build in the app folder. So here is going to be called app.urls. So with that in place, I can close that and now just build a new file called urls.py. And now inside of this, we now need to build a URL so that we can point our API to it. So I've gone ahead and created this file. So from Django URLs, we import the path, and then we also need to include the view because we want to make a link between this and the view. So our URL pattern is really simple. So our API is going to be consumed from post / So that's where we need to point view in a minute to post / and that's where we're going to be able to access the data from our database. So let's just go ahead and test this to see if it's working. Just save those. So before we can test this, just head back into the serializers.py if you're following this, because I forgot to include the S on the model and the fields. So before you start the server, just make sure you change that if you're following the code, and then just go ahead and run the server. It should be working okay. So I've installed Postman. If you've not got this installed, then it's worth a look. So Postman allows me to consume APIs and to test them. So let's test our API. So we know that the server address is 127.0.0.1.8,000, and we set up the URL of post /. So let's create a new tab and let's just test our API. So if you remember earlier, we also added some data into the database, so we should return something. So /post, I send that using get, and you can see here that I've returned from our Django API our 2 posts that we created. So that just confirms that this is working. And now we can move to the Vue JS application and build that and try and consume this API utilizing Vue. So now we're going to move across to Vue, and we're going to build a new Vue app to consume our API that we just created. So back in our command line here, we're just going to change the directory. And we're just going to go back into our folder. So we're just going to create a new Vue application within inside of this folder. So this application can be built absolutely anywhere. It is independent of this Django application. So I'm just going to make a new directory called Vue API, or just Vue app, sorry. And then we'll just head into that. Okay, so just make sure that you've got Node installed or npm manager. So you can obviously do that by typing in node view and the npm. So just make sure you've got that installed if you haven't already. And again, if you're not too familiar creating a Vue application, then head back into my previous tutorials where we just go through building a basic Vue application. So we're going to be utilizing the Vue CLI. So let's just run or create a new Vue app. So I just type in Vue, create, we're going to call this Vue Django REST. Okay, so that's going to build a new application. We're going to select the default. So once that's done, let's just run npm run serve just to make sure that everything is working okay. So there seems to be potentially an error, and that's because I've not moved into the app folder. So remember to move into your app folder, and then we can run that command again. Okay, so you can see that our server is running on localhost 8080. So let's just try that out. Localhost. And there we go. So our Vue app is working. So a quick view of our working folder here. We've got the Django app that we created, and then the main folder, Django REST API. We've got our virtual environment, and then the Vue app we've just created. So here we created the Vue app inside of a folder. So this is what we're working from here. So now let's just go into our code editor and let's just set this folder up. Okay, so now we have everything ready to start working with Vue. So the first task then, let's just get rid of remove the components that we don't need. So we don't need this helloworld.vue. Remove that. So just get rid of that. And then in our App.vue, we can just remove this information here. Let's just leave the template and the div here. We don't need to import that. We don't need these components. And we also don't need this style. Okay, so that just clears out everything that we don't need. And now we can start building what we do need. So this is the plan then now for this Vue application. So I'm going to be calling it a route because I know that a lot of you won't like the fact that I call it a router and not a router potentially. So we're going to first configure routes or the routes for this application. And then we'll move on to build our navigation bar and importing Bootstrap, and then the last phase is setting up axios. So let's now configure our routes. So we head into the App.vue first and then import the router view. So that gives us access to our router that we're going to build, and then we'll just create a simple style for our body, our padding, and the background color. So a little bit of styling, and that's it really for this section. We won't need to touch this App.vue anymore, so we can close that. So we're going to be building our own route, so let's create a new file. We're going to call it routes.js. So that's in the main project area here. So now we have a routes file. So before we head any further into this project, it's probably worth now actually installing the Vue Router. So let's create a new terminal. and then npm install, and then the Vue Router. So if you're running, I think it's npm manager 5 or below 5, version 5, then use the save. So you can save it in your dependencies. So npm install Vue Router. So we install that. Now we can go ahead and head back into our main.js file and then just connect this all up. So we need to import the router from /routes.js. Yep. And then we can go ahead and now add it to our project. So router. There we go. So that's now connected up. So next up, we're going to add some views. We're going to create a new folder called views inside of our project, and we'll create a new file. I'm going to call this posts.vue. So before we configure our routes page, it's worth reading through. We will just be following most of the mandatories that are required to build a router here, a router. So definitely head over to the Vue official pages and have a read through that if you don't quite understand what's happening in this next section. So let's head over to our routes.js, and we import in the Vue from Vue and Vue Router from Vue Router. And then we're going to be building a new route or route to posts. So we need to import that view that we just created. And then we use the view.use Vue Router. I've left some notes here. You can see here that we need to call this to make sure that the router is added to our middleware so that we can use it in our project. And then we set up our routes. So we're using mode history. Again, I've left a note here. So by default, URL hashes are used to simulate the full URL. So we just get rid of that and it makes it look prettier. So we use mode history and we created the base there for our URL. And then we add some routes. Okay, so there's only one route that we need to make. And we're going to make a home or a default or base route, so slash. And then we're going to give it a name of posts. And then the component that we're going to be using is posts. So that then obviously links to our post instance we made. Right, so that's a simple route there to our posts.vue. So now that's created, we're nearly ready to actually test this system out. So heading back into our command line, there doesn't seem to be any problems. Our server's still running. Let's just go back in and go to the posts. So I paste in this simple framework in preparation to develop this page, and it should instantly now change on the page. Yep, so now we can see hello world. So our routes are working, the application is working. Now we can move forward and start to connect to our API. Before we set up Axios, let's just create a navbar. So in components, I'm going to create a new file. I'm just going to call that navbar. That's the first step. And also I'm going to be utilizing Bootstrap for this project. So let's just head over to the terminal. And then npm install Bootstrap. So we just bring that into the project to make it easier to create some styling. So now I've imported Bootstrap. Let's just go into the main.js and just add it to our project. So we need to import this in. Bootstrap dist CSS Bootstrap. We use the min.css. So now Bootstrap is available within our project. So I've now gone ahead and just added a simple navigation bar to our project. I won't go through this line by line. You can see that I've included an asset, which is brand name. So I've added the brand name and I've also added a link. So this is a method of adding links via the router. You can see here I've used router link, and then I've passed in the name. So that's going to create the URL based upon what's configured in the router. So that should just be slash, given a name. So have a look at that. Apart from that, there's nothing else here that needs explaining really. Have a look at the code, which will be available on GitHub if you want to look through this here. Okay, so now we've got the navigation bar in place. Now let's just add it to our post. So to add our nav bar to posts, what we need to do is first of all import it in. So we import navbar from the components section, and then we add it to components, and then we just need to then include it where we want it on our page or our template, just right there. Okay, so now that's in place, that should now have configured and included the navbar on the page, so we can test that. Should happen automatically. Yep, so now we have our navigation bar within the template. So we're now on the last section. So now we're going to configure our Vue application to be able to get the data from our Django API and then serve it onto our page. So we're also going to need to go back into Django at this stage and just configure one more module, because we're going to need to allow access from external sources to access our API. So we're going to install cores. So let's just go through this stage by stage. First of all, we need to install Axios. Okay, so back in the terminal, notice that my terminal always starts blank. I'm using a virtual machine. So npm install axios. Should take a few moments. Okay, so now we've got that installed. We now need to make a new file. So let's make the new file in our directory. So new file, I'm going to call that axios-api.js. Okay, so that's now in place. Okay, so now then we're going to set up or create a new instance, and we're going to then make this available on other components inside of our application. So first of all, we need to import Axios. So import Axios from Axios. Okay, and now we're going to create a new instance with a custom configuration. So const get API equals axios dot create, and then we're going to need to now configure the base URL. So this base URL basically is the URL of where our API resides. So the base URL in this case is going to be our Django server address. So http://127.0.0.1 and then :8000. So that's currently where our Django application resides. Yours might be slightly different. And then we'll set a timeout. So if the request takes longer than the timeout, we'll get an error. Just normally means that the server isn't working correctly. So we now have that in place. So once that's in place, that's just the basic configuration. We can now export that so we can make it available in our other components. So let's export that as get API. Okay. Just before I finish, let's just change that. There we go. So now that's ready to start. Okay, so now we've got this base in place. There's not too much we need to do now. We just need to now head over to the posts component here, and we now just need to configure this page to access the data and return the data onto this page. So we're going to set up a simple Bootstrap framework here that utilizes cards. I'm not going to explain every line again. I'll just copy and paste this in, but by all means have a look at it, and of course you can change it. I'll go through the main components so you understand what's going on. So this is the Bootstrap component right here. You can see that we've created a container and then a row, and then inside of here I'm then using v4. So I'm going to create a loop, basically go through the data that we're going to collect from the API, the Django API. I'm just going to loop through it. Every time I loop through, it's going to run this section here. So you can see here I'm making a card, a Bootstrap card, and every time I loop out, I want to collect the data from that instance within the loop, and I want to collect and output the post title and the post content. So that's what's going to be outputted from the data that's returned from our Django API. So we simply loop out the data once we've collected the data, and we'll go through that in a second. And then we're going to output post title and post content. Okay, so to finish this off, so within the script section of our posts component, first of all, we get the information that we set up in our Axios API, and that's basically the we created a new instance of Axios, so we created a base URL and a timeout, so we get all that information. We need that. We've obviously imported our navbar, and now we create a data point so we can put our data that's returned from our Django API so that we can then use it and loop it out on our page. So this is how simple it is now to fetch data from our API. So here we're creating using an instance lifecycle hook created. It's worth reading into the lifecycle hooks of Vue if you want to understand more about Vue. So basically here we're saying that if Vue instance is created, we're then going to run this script here, or this piece of code here. So all that's happening here in general terms is we're getting the data from, or we're forming the URL, so /posts, including the data from our Axios API file. So the base, we use the base, and then we connect it to /posts to then connect to our API, or Django API. And then we get a response. So if we do get a response, we just log that in the console that we've got a response. That's handy. If our code up here isn't working for some reason, but we are getting a response from the API that we've received the data, then there must be a problem with the code above there. So we get the response, response.data, and then we put it into our array, and then we can make that available now for the v4 here so that we can loop out the data on our page. And like we've seen before, we loop out the post content and we loop out the title. So now this is in place. Let's just see if this is working. It shouldn't be working, so let's just see if it is working or not. Go into our page, refresh. Now let's just go into our console here, and you can see that there is an error. So at the moment there is no access to this. It says a blocked by cause policy. So at the moment there's a problem accessing our data from Django. So now we need to head into Django and finish the configuration there. So the last step of this Django installation is the cross-origin resource sharing. So we need to install cause to allow access to our API, our Django API, so that it can be accessed from other resources, from other domains. So first of all, you can see here we need to just install the Django core headers, and then you can just simply go through, and I've left a link here. You can simply just go through the configuration options that are available in the manual, and we just basically need to add cause to the setting app and then install into the middleware, and then create a whitelist. It's as simple as that. So let's first of all pip install Django cause headers. So I'm back in again. So I'm back in the Django application again. I'll just head over to the command prompt. So I'll just stop the server and then I will install the cause package. Okay, so that's now available. So let's head back into our system. And now we need to configure the settings file. So in our main app, the REST API, we need to go to settings. And now we just need to add some items into the settings here. Okay. So the first thing we need to do, again, following the cause instructions in the manual, we just need to go into the middleware and drop in the cause middleware. So right there, so cause header middleware.cause middleware. So that's the first thing that we need to configure. So next up, we then need to configure the whitelist. So this is basically just a list of domains that is allowed access to our API. So here I've utilized http://localhost 8080. That's, if you remember, is our Vue server address. So I've also included the 127 version as well. So that's a whitelist, a list of domains that can have access to our API. And then last of all, let's not forget to add the cause header to the installed apps. So let's restart the Django server. And then head back into our application. We can refresh the page this time, and you can notice that now our Vue application is serving the data from the Django API. So we're now successful in viewing the data from the API with Vue. So we can test this. Let's just add a new post in Django. So new post 3. And just press save. And then we go back into our into Vue. And we just refresh. And you can see now we have the new data appear. So that completes this tutorial. So remember, in the next tutorial, we're now going to set up authentication so that we need to be authenticated in order to access this data from the server. So thank you very much. Hopefully you've gained something from this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we then apply the authentication to both Django and the Vue application so that you need to be authenticated to access the data from the Django API. As per normal, if you've got any questions you want to ask, then please add that either on the Facebook page or utilize the comment section of YouTube. Hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.